Welcome to today's Improving Lunch and Learn event. My name is Sean Mosier. I'll be moderating this event. For some housekeeping items, I want to mention that there will be a real-time polling website throughout the presentation. It'll be available, so if you can open another browser window and keep it next to your presentation window so we can interact with each other as we go through the presentation. I will ask you to use the Q&A panel on the right side of the event window if you have questions. We'll work along with some of our other moderators to do the best we can to answer as many questions as possible. Some may be answered privately, some may be brought up during the course of the presentation, so keep an eye on that. Today, I would like to introduce to you our presenters, Christopher Lee and Griffin Bayer. Chris is our principal consultant focusing on cloud security, and Griffin is our technical director who focuses on cloud and systems management. So I'd like to take this opportunity to hand it off to you, Griffin. Griffin, you are on mute.
All right, should be good now. Thank you, Sean, for the introduction. Appreciate everyone joining. Definitely want to encourage you guys to interact with our polls, and we'll be taking Q&A at some natural pause points throughout. So why we're here today, what we want to do is focus on some operational and conceptual practices, specifically around securing your company's data in the new workforce that has become drastically more remote as a result of the new normal that we're in. You'll see more of a specific reference to Microsoft technologies, and really what we're going to try to visualize and help you identify where there might be dark space gaps. And what I mean by dark space gaps is potential areas where, as a result of the influx in remote work for a given company, where there may be threat vectors or things that you haven't thought of as a part of this new normal that we're living in. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Chris Lee, and hope you all enjoy the content.
Thank you, Griffin. So to understand where we need to talk about data security, we kind of have to understand where we're coming from a operational perspective to begin with. So my slide is not updating, sorry. There we go. All right, so if we look at how operations typically have occurred in the past, we had a huge significant dependency on the corporate network. The corporate network contained our endpoints, which were our computers typically managed on an isolated network segment. Our applications, our databases, our file servers were all on premises. And if we were lucky enough to have some mobile devices allowed to connect to our internal network, they were often company issued and definitely managed, but even then they were restricted on what they could be used for in the work environment. As we looked at how we got out to the internet, there was always a complex network security architecture put into place, not only just with our switches internally, but then our first step out was probably a web filter of some sort that would dictate how or what we're able to get to on the internet from our internal network. And then after that, we would have to pass through probably a series of firewalls, one segregated in our corporate network from our DMZ, and then from the DMZ out to the internet before we actually reached the internet. We also probably had a small subset of users that were able to work remotely, again, from managed laptops. But to access resources, they would have to use a VPN solution to come back into the network to access the applications, the file servers. But what this also did is it tunneled network or internet bound traffic through the same path to go through our security layers. So our VPN in clients would also have to go through our web filters and our firewalls to get out to the internet. So this provided us a perception that we knew what was going on in the environment because we were seeing what was going on at the network layer. But that actually wasn't everything that was occurring in our environment. If we look at how things have changed, we really have a decreased dependency on the corporate network. This is a much smaller environment as it is in the past, mostly because we're relocating applications and databases and file servers up to the cloud. We still have our managed computers, company owned, but maybe we have a couple BYOD or personally owned devices allowed to connect to our corporate network. We've seen a big increase in mobile device usage. But one thing I want to point out as we talk through this change is what we're seeing as a result of this pandemic is not a tipping point, or it's not a cause or a reason for us to have all of these capabilities to work in the cloud or work remotely. The capability for us to work at home or from wherever has been there for a while, ever since cloud solutions became popular. So the good thing is, as we respond to this work at home pandemic, we have the tools and capabilities available to us to accommodate that work from home. But one thing that we've seen as a direct result of the pandemic is an influx of personally owned devices connected to the corporate environment. The reason for this is many businesses may not have been prepared to make that significant jump into the majority of their workforce working remotely. Prior to the pandemic, maybe 10% of the workforce was working from home. And then after the pandemic hit, now 90% of the workforce is working from home. What about those users that weren't issued company laptops or mobile devices that would enable them to work securely from home? Businesses had an option. They could either turn off the lights and close up shop and wait the pandemic out, or they could make a quick decision to say, you know what, we don't have the laptops, but you have a personal computer at home. Go ahead and use that to conduct your business functions. Another thing that we've seen as a direct result of the pandemic, and it's related to that influx of personal devices, is that we would typically see you had to VPN back into the corporate network. Well, that was fine when you had that 10% working from home. But now that you have 90% working from home, can your VPN solution handle that increased load? And what we've seen is that some don't. So we've had to come to another quick decision. Do we require users to use the VPN, or can we just allow them to go to the internet directly? The thing that we lose by taking that approach is that we miss out on some of those signals, some of those details that we can see from our network security layer, such as our web filter and our firewalls. So this is the new norm. But as I said, it's not anything that has come up just because of the pandemic specifically. We've kind of been forced to adopt it much quicker than where our current pace was actually at. If we look at the risks, though, and we can go on about tons of different risks that have come up, not just from working from home, but from cloud in general, we would have too much to talk about. So what we've done is we've combined all of the risks that have popped up because of this immediate work from home situation into 4 categories. And as I mentioned before, the first one here, unmanaged devices, that's a result of businesses telling their employees, go ahead, use your personal device because we have to keep business going. So we have this influx of unmanaged devices accessing the corporate networks. That leads into our second risk category, which is malware and ransomware. We don't know what's on those machines. We don't know what they've been used in the past. We don't have any monitoring. So they may already be infected with some kind of malware, and we're allowing them now to connect to our corporate resources, which may allow that infection to spread across other endpoints throughout the environment. Hacking and breach, those are, we've seen, because bad actors know businesses are taking the necessary steps to enable remote work, they're trying to take advantage of that. They know people are being, or companies are making quick decisions to enable this at-home work capacity, and they're going to try to leverage that as an opportunity to break into your environment. And that leads into what we're really here to talk about, is the data, securing the data itself. When a bad actor is going to get into your network, or they're trying to breach your environment, there's really 2 reasons why they're trying to do that. The first is they just want to be disruptive, and maybe that causes you some, it comes at your expense, but it's not really going to benefit them a whole lot. So the second reason why they're trying to get into your environment is because there's some financial gain for them, and that's your data. And you might not think there's a whole lot of value to your data, but if you think about it, you may have employee information on record. You may have customer information, payment information for those customers. That's all valuable to those bad actors. And if they can extract that out, then they can now use that for some financial gain of their own. So we put a poll up here on screen just to kind of get an idea of where some of your biggest concerns lie with remote work, categorized into those 4 categories that we just discussed. And I know there's a little bit of a lag here, so we won't spend too much time on this slide to see where all the responses come in. But if you can, as Sean had mentioned, make sure you open up a secondary browser or a new tab and go to our URL here up at the top so that you can respond to some of the future polls that we do have coming up. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of change in the poll right now. So I guess I'll just go ahead and move on. As I said, I don't want to spend too much time waiting for the results coming in. So if you can have that browser up to jump on those a little bit early, great. So when we start looking at security, oh, there we see something's changing. So breach, hacked, top looks like that's kind of a higher priority here. I honestly thought we would see more on the identity theft and data loss, but that's okay. Getting hacked, breach is definitely a big concern because it does lead to that data breach. So the good thing is we're going to talk about all 4 of these categories and the tools and the practices you should be implementing to address some of those risks. So the first thing we want to talk about with security is we start with identity. And what is identity? It's really credentials, right? Your username and your password. But those aren't secure. You know, for most cases, your username is most likely your email address. So that's 50% of your credential right there. And as we get to passwords, well, in reality, password practices are just not strong enough today. So one thing I do want to point out here, we're not going to dive into the concept of phishing, but if for those of you who are not familiar with what phishing is, it's an email campaign run by a bad actor. So for example, I would send out an email that's trying to masquerade as your bank or your insurance company or even Microsoft itself and try to trick you into going into my website that looks like your bank's login page and typing in your credentials. In that case, you are handing me your username and password. So even if we had strong password practices, what good is it at that point? Because you're giving me your credentials. But there is something that we can start with to improve our overall security posture. And the first thing here is Azure AD password protection. You know, as I mentioned, passwords are just weak by nature because we don't follow good practices for establishing strong passwords. Azure AD password protection is Microsoft's capability of investigation or analytics of all the signals they see. They work with cybersecurity groups as well to develop a custom dictionary of what are weak passwords. Now, this is enabled by default for Azure AD, but most of us, we have synchronized identities, which means our password is authored on premises. So when we synchronize that password up, we're not taking advantage of password protection by default, but we can and we should. We can extend Azure AD password protection on-premise using a couple agents on our domain controllers and a connector that lets our domain controllers talk to the Azure AD password service so that we can prevent bad passwords. Now, what does this do on top of what our current password policies may be? Well, if you think about on-premise Active Directory, your password policy may be, if it's the standard, I think it's 8 characters long, a special character, a letter, and a number. So if we follow the Active Directory complexity requirements, the password summer 2020 with an exclamation point meets those complexity requirements. But is that really a strong password? It's not. Password protection will actually detect that and recognize that, hey, that's not that strong of a password. I'm not going to let you use it. So this compounds on top of what Active Directory password policies can provide, and we should be extending this down on premises so that our users can't use weak or easily compromisable passwords, even if they meet the Active Directory password requirements. But remember, I said passwords aren't safe in general, and as we build upon that concept, the thing that I hope everyone walks away from this session with, if there is one thing, I hope it's this: multi-factor authentication, and you should be using it. What is it? Multi-factor authentication is a combination of two of three things. So the first one, something that you know. That's your username and password combination. But that's something that you know, and that's something that can be easily communicated or shared. So it's really not that secure. So we want to combine that with one of the other two items here, something that you are, or I'm sorry, something that you have, which would be your cell phone, a hardware security token, or even your desk phone, and then something that you are, which is your fingerprint or even a facial recognition solution. So when you add one of those two on top of your username and password, your account becomes significantly more secure. And I can't emphasize this enough. If we look back at the previous slide, I had a statistic up there that 81% of attacks are credential-based. The vast majority are credential-based, and multi-factor authentication can prevent almost all of those attacks. So we should be using multi-factor authentication. There's really not a reason not to. We could take this a step further and start talking about a concept called passwordless authentication. This is a relatively newer concept, and it's actually a much more robust topic that I'm going to have time to go into right now. If you have interest in passwordless, go ahead and use the Q&A. Let us know, give us your contact information, and if there's enough interest, maybe we'll put together another session on passwordless authentication. But the concept behind passwordless steps up multi-factor by saying, let's get rid of the username and password altogether from a user perspective, and let's use something that is physically there with them. So FIDO security keys, Windows Hello for Business. If you haven't seen this, that's where the facial recognition or a fingerprint reader logs you into your computer. We can also use the Microsoft Authenticator app. So a lot of cool stuff coming down the road, but I wanted to mention it, just too much to go into during this session. The last item I'm going to talk about when it comes to identity is conditional access. And there's a lot more that we could be doing, a lot more tools available to us to be addressing the identity. And just for the sake of time, conditional access is going to be the main one I focus on for right now. And the slide here is not the prettiest, but in my defense, I did steal it from Microsoft because it's a good slide and there's a lot of detail here, and there was no reason for me to recreate the wheel. But conditional access is our front door security. It's what tells us, are you allowed in or are you not? We can look at signals such as your user account, what device you're coming from, where you're coming from. If you're coming from the corporate office or if you're coming from a different country altogether, we can detect that. What service are you trying to reach? Are you trying to get to Exchange Online or SharePoint Online or even a third-party SaaS app? And then we can also look at what's the client that you're using. Are you using a browser or are you using a desktop app like Outlook? We can combine all of these signals with some machine learning and analytics that Microsoft does on the back end to identify some risk as well. Maybe you're coming from a location that's not common for your activity. That can increase a risk score, which might determine whether you're allowed in or not. But we can apply some controls based on all of those signals and say, yes, you're allowed in, or no, we're going to block your access. Or we can say, you know what? Your risk is a little higher. We want to require you to provide MFA before we allow you in. So this is our front door security that we should have a policy at least in place to do something. Otherwise, by default, cloud is wide open. You can access from any device, any user, any location. And that's probably not the most ideal solution if you have sensitive information in your environment. So you definitely want to configure something with conditional access, and we should be. Even if it's a policy as simple as looking at location. Maybe your business doesn't do business or work with customers outside of the United States. So a simple policy of saying anything coming from outside of the United States, block. Or maybe it's something as simple as saying everyone's required to provide multi-factor authentication. Those two policies are very simple but very powerful and can result in a significant increase on your overall security posture. So we do have another poll up here. And while we wait for some responses on the poll, Sean, are there any questions from the Q&A that we want to address?
I have two questions for you, Chris. So the first question is, can you use a third-party MFA provider other than Azure MFA?
The short answer is yes. You can use a third-party MFA provider. There is a limit on, Microsoft has integration with only a specific few, so it does depend on what your provider is, but we can integrate third-party providers through conditional access through something called custom controls, so we can use that.
Okay. The second question is, can you use hardware tokens with Azure MFA?
Also, short answer is yes on that one. You can, so if you're using a third-party provider, if they support hardware tokens and that third-party provider is allowed to be integrated or can be integrated with Azure AD, then by process there, those hardware tokens are compatible. You can also register hardware tokens with Azure AD directly. So there are some requirements around that, though, on what hardware tokens are actually supported. There's some guidance from Microsoft if you look it up online, but it has to do with the encryption level and then also the token code refresh intervals, things like that. But yes, we can use third-party tokens.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Griffin, who will talk about devices.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. So as Chris was leading with identity is really the focus of that initial piece, that first layer, protecting the front door. The next piece that we're going to discuss is at the device level, and what basically the mechanism in which you are interfacing with the content and things throughout your company. What we've seen is that there's been an influx of new device types, and this is prior to anything new, but it's amplified right now, mostly because now you're seeing a giant increase in personal devices that are within the corporate ecosystem. So this will expand on to wearables, and eventually we'll have smart glasses, smart cars, all of these things that really end up having company intellectual property on them. So the second layer that we're talking about, in which you need to secure, is at that device level. And again, this is amplified because of more personal devices being within the ecosystem. Adding to that, once you have a said device, whether that's your phone or your tablet, or even a laptop computer, the next layer, again, we think of security, applying security in layered approaches. So you're protecting the front door with that identity. The next is on the device, the application itself, where that content is actually residing. So within Microsoft Intune, there is a pretty cool policy that that is application protection policies. What they do is they containerize any corporate data that ties back to that identity, so that you can ensure that on any given device, you can still access the corporate content that is deemed allowed, but also protect from data loss, meaning within that said container, say you have a company email and you're using the Outlook mobile, Outlook Office 365 productivity suite, you can't copy out data and paste it into something that's personal. And the idea of this is that you're managing at the application layer, not necessarily managing someone's personal device. We'll get into the device trust in just a second, but that's the intent here, and this is going to be the new norm, more and more so. It's the way things are shifting, as being more at this layer as opposed to managing the device itself. And what's nice about this is you can have you have your personal data as well that's segregated, so that I think of it like an analogy of a house. Since we're protecting the front door, I'll stick with that, and it's tangible here as well. So you have company property within your house, but the rest of it is your personal data, if you will, if we're using that metaphor. So really, from a company standpoint, you want to make sure that your corporate assets, being that intellectual property and data, are protected, even in someone's personal device. The third piece is device trust. So typically, there's really two specific device trust levels that I'm going to talk about. One is more of the your laptop is corporate owned and it is joined and known onto an on-premises domain, and that's the your typical Windows device, your Windows 10, or hopefully you're not on Windows 7, but your typical Windows asset that is joined there, and that's how you know that this is company owned. It has corporate policies that are traversed down through group policy or configuration manager, now called Microsoft Endpoint Manager. That's that first level. The second is along with Intune and being in this kind of cloud connected device world, you can actually directly enroll those. And this extends to not just Windows devices, but also Apple, Android, whether that's iOS, Mac OS X, and several different flavors of Android that can actually be enrolled. And what this does is it gives us another trust layer. So if you were saying at the identity, we're protecting the front door, and I'm going to add on to what Chris was saying about conditional access, this can give you another piece of criteria that says whether or not you can access a piece of company data. The third piece is there's a high number of devices that are not trusted at all, or maybe your personal device, you don't want to be fully enrolled. When you're enrolled with Intune, you can control other device configurations, making sure that security patches are applied, that it's updated, but maybe you don't want your device to be managed at all. So I think that's it leads into another topic that's going to be in the latter part of this presentation that Chris will be covering, but it's how can you be productive but also secure from any device without necessarily having to trust the device itself. But it's still something to be very cognizant of. The last piece that I want to talk about is Microsoft Defender ATP. And this is really in assuming that after you're doing everything you can to protect that front door and protect your data, but on the devices itself, and specifically your Windows devices, how are you picking up on some of these more advanced threats? Because inevitably there's going to be bad actors that get into the environment. And Defender ATP is more behavioral based, not definition based. So it's picking up on anomalous behavior that it can use to categorize and flag, and then in cases also automated remediation of zero-day threats. So it's a very cool piece. You're thinking of in an assumed breach type world, but it adds that additional layer tied across when you span all of these different layers of security to ensure that your company's data is actually secure. And it's very powerful because you have the machine learning and AI backed behind the power of the cloud to pick up on these behavioral based anomalies that could be threats. It also minimizes the ability to pick up false positives. So it's a unique tool set in that regard. So we're going to move into our next poll, and seeing some already are responding. And does your company support BYOD? So we're seeing, it looks like a good chunk of folks that are attending, that you can work on their personal devices. So with that, I'm going to pause and see if there are any additional questions with the content I just covered. Sean, do we have any questions?
Not at this time, Griffin.
All righty. Well, I'm going to pass it back over to Chris, and we will continue on.
All right, thank you, Griffin. So the next topic I want to talk about is the applications themselves. So I really hated putting this really bright yellow, red, flashy number up here, but I think it's very important for us to understand. And I know I've already talked about passwords, but we have to consider passwords as we look at the app access itself. So 99% of users reuse passwords across accounts. So that is very important one. Again, going back to my previous statistics about credentials being, or credential attacks being the most common type of attack. Why is this an issue? Well, this statistic tells me that most of us are using the same password to log into our corporate environment as we are our bank account, as we are our Gmail or our Hotmail or our Outlook.com accounts, which ultimately, if one of those external accounts gets compromised, all of my accounts get compromised. So it's very, very bad when we do this, but the reality is people do. We all do. We all reuse passwords. So what can we do to address this from the application level? And that's really looking at the concept of single sign-on. The shift over to single sign-on is not going to be something that occurs for you overnight, but it is something that we should be working towards. And the main reason is this: the less credential prompts, the less times a user has to enter in their username and password, the better. We want to get them into this mindset of, if I'm getting prompted outside of logging into my computer for my username and password, something doesn't seem right. And if that's the mindset that they can achieve, then they're not going to be as susceptible to phishing attacks or other attacks like that. So how can we leverage single sign-on? Well, the good thing is Azure AD already works with a lot of other cloud services out there. Whether you're using Salesforce or Dropbox, even Slack, you can integrate Azure AD authentication so that once you log into your machine, I don't have to go log in. I open up the web page for Salesforce and it just automatically logs me in for me, because it's using the same credentials that I've used for logging into my machine. Now, you might be wondering, how does that fix anything based on that statistic I just showed? Isn't that the same thing as reusing the same username or password? And technically it would be, but we can apply security around that. We can apply our conditional access around that. So now all the controls that I have in place with conditional access, such as require an MFA, I can now do for all of my users when they go to access Dropbox or Google or Salesforce. So I'm getting that extra layer of security built on top of that. So that works great when it's another cloud app, but how do we address that for maybe applications that are on-premise? If we still have to, if we're trying to get away from having users enter in usernames and passwords, I'm going to have something to address applications that are on-premise that are prompting for credentials. And there's a solution for that. It's the Azure AD App Proxy. And what this does is it creates an outbound connection. There's a connector that gets installed on-prem. It creates an outbound connection to Azure AD and then publishes your on-premise apps. So now the same benefits that come along to third-party SaaS apps, I can now take advantage of for my on-premise apps as well. I can use conditional access to require MFA or block access if I'm coming from an untrusted device. I have all of those capabilities now built into access in my on-premises applications as well. So as I said, moving towards this single sign-on is not something that will happen overnight. There's definitely some planning and preparations that need to go into that, but everyone should be moving in this direction. We should be trying to get away from users having to enter in their credentials on a regular basis. We want that to be the anomaly when they do have to enter credentials, and that will help reduce our overall susceptibility to attacks. So now we get to what really matters, and that's the data. And I have a statistic up here that I found was very interesting, and it's actually a year or two old, but 500,000 tweets every minute. That equates to over 8,000 tweets per second. Now, how does that relate to what we're talking about? that just demonstrates how easy it is for information to be communicated these days. How easy it is for something to be distributed over the internet. If we can send over 8,000 tweets per second, just think of how much confidential information can be shared every minute. So we have to start looking at how do we protect the data. We talked about the identity and closing that front door as much as possible. We talked about securing the devices or controlling the data on the devices themselves. We talked a little bit about applications with the access to the apps, but let's look past all of that and say, all right, now we have the data. I want to say I can protect that data regardless of where it's located, what device, what trust level it is. And we have a solution to do that. Microsoft Information Protection, or MIP, might be a new name for you. You might be more familiar with the name Azure Information Protection, or AIP. Relatively, it's the same thing. They're not replacements of each other, but I'm going to refer to them as synonymous for the purpose of this discussion, at least. So the first step is we can't protect what we don't know that we have. So we have to use something to discover our data. What do we have in our environment? And fortunately, AIP and MIP provides a tool called the scanner, MIP scanner or AIP scanner. And this is something that we can install on premise, but it can look at all of our on-premise file repositories, our shared folder locations, our on-premise SharePoint sites, and evaluate that data to identify if there's any sensitive information types. So social security numbers, credit card numbers, bank account numbers, things like that. And it can report back to us and say, hey, you've got this type of information in your environment. And once we know what information we have, then we can start to develop a plan on how to protect that data using MIP labels or AIP labels. And think of a label as nothing more than encryption. I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but it's encrypting the document. You're applying an encryption that only designated people can decrypt. So now that we know we have sensitive information, let's go ahead and protect that with a MIP label. We can take that one step further and look at data loss prevention. And that's actually inspecting the data as it is communicated. So when I send an email, data loss prevention kicks in. When I do a SharePoint sharing link, data loss prevention kicks in, and it inspects what am I trying to share or communicate. And if it detects sensitive information, we can apply a protection, a MIP label to that data while it's being shared out. So we don't have to rely on the user to know, hey, I have to go protect this because it's sensitive information. So those three items are available to us with the base AIP or MIP deployments. So Microsoft has several default labels and a global policy or an organization-wide policy that we can enable that doesn't enforce the use of MIP, but it at least enables users to consume MIP, to be able to protect documents. There's nothing automated at that point, but we give the users the opportunity to get familiar with MIP, because taking on an entire deployment of information protection is not something that we can quickly do. You have to have a strong data classification strategy in place, and that's not going to happen quickly. You're going to have to inspect your data. You're going to have to go through these first three items here to help you develop what that strategy should be. But once you get to that point, then we can leverage automation by automatically classifying data as it's created or edited. So as I'm typing up my Word document and I put a social security number in there, the system detects that and says, hey, we got to protect this. And it will apply a MIP label because it detected something sensitive automatically. Again, taking it out of the user hands. So one way that we can expand on this a little bit is looking at how do we communicate today, and that's through email. It's a very wide range of communications. We're sending documents, we're sending meeting invites. We're pretty much communicating with each other via email. And many people believe email is secure, but it's not. So leveraging the capabilities in AIP or rights management or information protection, there's a feature that we should also be enabling, and that's Office 365 message encryption. And to explain why this is necessary, if we look at how we typically email today, I might be over here on the left with my email server. Maybe that's Exchange, maybe that's Exchange Online. Doesn't matter. For this example, it's just my email system. And I want to email my friend over here on the right. So our servers probably support what's known as transport layer security, or TLS, which means they can establish a secure connection to each other, an encrypted connection. So when I send that email, great, it's over an encrypted connection and my friend gets his email message. But what if my friend has a mail hygiene gateway before his mail server? So he has another system sitting in front, and that system is configured to establish a TLS connection. But you know what? Maybe someone inside his organization misconfigured or didn't configure the connection from his hygiene solution back to his mail server correctly, and that's now using an unencrypted connection. So when I go to send that email, now my little mail ninja here who has infiltrated the corporate network on my friend's side can now steal a copy of that message. So that is no longer secure. Let's take this a step further and say that maybe my friend's email hygiene lives in the cloud. Maybe they're using a third-party service. Maybe they're using even a virtual appliance hosted in the cloud as their mail hygiene. Again, I can establish that secure connection with that first endpoint, which is their hygiene solution, but I can't guarantee that the subsequent paths are encrypted. So now when I send that message, I could have my mail ninja here over on the internet and they could intercept that message, as well as someone on my friend's internal network intercept that message. Because this is in the cloud, this is public internet, which means almost anybody could steal that email. So that's very bad. I can't guarantee the connectivity between these two endpoints. I can only guarantee from my side that my next hop, which is this mail hygiene solution, supports TLS. After that, it's the Wild West, and I'm putting my trust that my friend has gone through, or his company has gone through, the necessary configurations to establish secure mail routing. But maybe I can't do that with everyone. So how can I send that message? Well, I need to use information protection and encrypt that message using Office 365 message encryption. So now when I send that message, it doesn't matter that it traverses those unencrypted channels. Anyone else who intercepts that message can't open it because they haven't been given rights. So that's just one example of how we can extend information protection, and something that we should be using today. If you don't have message encryption enabled in your Office 365 tenants and it's available to you, you should be using it. The last item I'm going to talk about is a component called Microsoft Cloud App Security, or MCAS. It is a cloud security broker, and for that probably doesn't mean a whole lot to a lot of you. It's essentially a proxy in the cloud. It knows how to communicate with other third-party SaaS apps, and it can real-time dynamically manipulate my session with those services. So I could have a whole session on MCAS, so we're going to talk about it very light here. But again, if you have interest in MCAS, go ahead and put your information in the Q&A, and we'll reach out. Or if there's enough interest, we'll maybe put together a session on MCAS altogether. But as a very basic example of what MCAS can do, and again, this is just a little piece of what MCAS is. If I have my geek over here and he wants to upload a file, let's say it's to Dropbox. It doesn't have to be Office 365. But it's to Dropbox. So he wants to upload a file with sensitive information. Okay, great, he does that. MCAS detects that sensitive information being uploaded to that third-party SaaS app and automatically applies a protection label to it because it knows it's sensitive. But then I go ahead and try to create a sharing link out of one or a Dropbox or Box itself and share that to someone outside the organization. So I create a sharing link, but you know what? That external user, because of my protection by MCAS, is not allowed to open that file. They won't be able to access it. They may be able to download a copy of it, but they'll never be able to open it because that user, that external entity, has not been given rights to it. And then finally, my IT admin might get an alert saying, hey, this file was attempted to be shared. So that's a very high-level, basic description of what MCAS can do. And there's a lot more to it. So definitely let us know if you have more interest to learn more about MCAS specifically and how it can help you.
One thing to add there, Chris, on MCAS. So with the current workforce, like the tactical things that have had to be done to make companies maintain productivity, is they're working on their personal devices, and you have an oversaturated VPN. Well, you're seeing end users go and use whatever mechanism they can to collaborate with their other teammates, or if they've got customers and clients. So you're seeing content that they're going and signing up for some of these services that are out there and they're in that dark space. So yeah, again, we could go into great detail on MCAS as a single topic if you guys have more questions or pieces from that perspective. But it's a powerful tool, especially with the way people are reacting to having to work remotely.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because as you said, those scenarios where you can't manage the device, you can't establish trust with the device, we can control the user session. So they can still use that device, but we won't let any data be downloaded. They can only use the web browser to access cloud services in the cloud. So that's another really great use case for MCAS. So with that, Sean, are there any questions at this time that we want to bring up there in the Q&A here, or the poll slide?
I do have a couple more questions for you, Chris.
Okay.
The first is, can App Proxy work with a non-web application that requires a desktop client to be installed?
Yes, but App Proxy is mostly designed to work with web applications. So if you have an app on-prem that's browser-based, great, we're going to be able to work with it. But if it does require that desktop client to be installed, we can integrate, but the application has to support the Microsoft Authentication Library, or MSAL. And in that case, you'd have to check with the app vendor to see if they support that or not. But technically, we can integrate with thick, quote unquote, thick client applications and take advantage of App Proxy.
All right. What are the licensing requirements for each of the capabilities described for information protection?
Okay, so the basic items that I described, those first three columns, those are all included with either the standalone Azure Information Protection Plan 1 license or your EMS E3 license. Rule of thumb is, a lot of this stuff is included in the E3 or P1 level of these licenses, but once you get to the automation component, so that last column to where we wanted to automatically detect as a user is writing a document or opening up a document, we want to automatically detect that content and apply the protection. That automation requires the Azure Information Protection P2 license or the EMS E5 license. All right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we talked about a lot of the risks, a lot of the tools that we have available to us, but let's align those back to where they fall into each one of these categories. What tools do what for us underneath our known risks out in the cloud? So the first one we talked about was password protection. Trying to prevent users from using weak and easily compromisable passwords. Again, we need to extend that on-premise, and everyone who has an Azure AD P1 license, we should be doing this because it's going to significantly help on our password security posture. But passwords are weak, so we definitely want to also be enabling multi-factor authentication. So again, there's really no reason I can think of why you should not be leveraging multi-factor authentication. If we did want to take that a step further with passwordless, we could. That would also help out by reducing the users from even leveraging a password altogether. But we also need to close the front door. Again, cloud services are open by default. Anywhere, any device. We just don't want that, in all honesty. We want to control that. So conditional access is our first step to putting policies in place that control who's allowed in from where and what they can get to. So definitely recommend everyone has something configured for conditional access. As we move into devices, the app protection comes into play to say, you know what, maybe we can't manage that device, but at least let's containerize our data on that device so that we can control the data itself. So if we wanted to enforce that it can't be pulled out of that app and paste it into a different app, great, we can do that. But we can also pull that data back then if necessary. And if we can get to it, device trust, establishing a degree of trust with the device so that the employee can be more productive, have a little more flexibility in what they can do. And then Defender ATP aligns perfectly with unmanaged devices and malware and ransomware, because it's that real-time monitoring. And you know, as Griffin had mentioned, it's not signature based, it's analytics based. It's going to look at what's going on not just one device, but several devices, and try to correlate all those signals, so that we can ensure that if there's an active attack, it can be blocked immediately. As we look at applications, if we can reduce the number of prompts, credential prompts our users get, great. We can start to shift their mindset to not having to enter credentials all the time. And if we can do that, then when they do get prompted for their username and password, that should be a red flag for them. So if we can get to that single sign-on, great. It's not an overnight change, but it's something we all should be working towards, especially with cloud apps. And then we need to start looking at our on-premise apps with Azure AD App Protection. Again, just going back to that, reduce the number of credential prompts. After the apps, we can apply protection to the data itself. So information protection, again, I can protect a document, copy it to a flash drive, and hand that flash drive to anybody outside of my company and be confident they can't open up that document. They may have physical possession of it, but they cannot open it because I haven't given them the permissions to do so. That also applies to our primary means of communication with Office 365 message encryption. So if you're not using it today and you do need to communicate sensitive information, turn it on. There's a lot of flexibility here on how we enforce it, whether it's detection of sensitive information from a DLP policy, or if we give the user an option to manually encrypt it by using a button in Outlook. It's very simple, but very powerful. And then MCAS is our final layer there. And you know, there's a lot there to it. We gave you a very basic example with that file sharing. Griffin brought up a great point about being able to control data for unmanaged devices, but that kind of wraps up our security posture when it comes to securing our data in the cloud. So I want to thank everyone for their time, for attending our session. I hope that you're able to walk away with something valuable, something that you can go back to your environments or your employees and share to help increase your overall data security posture. And with that, I'll turn it to Sean.
Thank you, Chris. So at this time, we want to open up the floor for some questions. We have a few more minutes remaining. The queue is empty right now, so I'll take this moment to remind everyone that we can access recordings of prior events on our virtual events page, improving.com/virtual-events. I'm also going to be posting the survey link in the chat window here right about now, and that should give everybody access to the post-event survey. Please take a few minutes, and it's a short survey. Let us know what your thoughts are. If you have any additional questions that we didn't get in during today's broadcast, we'd be happy to follow up with you. And so just take a moment and let us know what you think.
Yep, again, thank you everyone for joining as we're waiting to see if questions get queued up. Hopefully this helped paint the picture of there's all these pieces and how they overlay together to help fill in those dark spaces that you need to be thinking about in the current climate that we're in. With that, yeah, I appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully this was beneficial.
I did see one question. Can login be integrated with a SIM? Absolutely. So based on where we're getting the logs from, whether it's Azure AD, whether it's MCAS or Defender ATP, we can definitely get those logs into a third-party SIM, or if you're using Microsoft's Azure Sentinel as a SIM, great. But we do have that capability as well. So if you wanted to retain those logs for a longer period than the default retention within Microsoft, we can definitely do that. So sorry, just wanted to jump in there since I saw one question pop up.
All right. Well, it looks like we got one more quick question for you. Best practices for license to use. Recently found couldn't add security I needed with only an E3 license. So what license level would you recommend?
Well, that's unfortunately not an easy question to answer because it's really based on what your security needs are. Typically, the EMS E3 contains the majority of the capabilities out there. There are going to be scenarios to where the E5 or an individual P2 might be necessary. So included in EMS E3, you're going to have Azure AD P1, you're going to have AIP P1, you're going to have Intune included in all of those. So most of the stuff that we talked about is available in the EMS E3 license. Now, when you start looking at some of the automation, specifically around AIP or MIP, that's going to be the P2 for that, or the EMS E5. That also, the EMS E5, I believe, and Griffin, keep me honest on this one, I believe it also includes the MCAS
Yes.
product.
Yeah, M365 or EMS E5. Yeah, it includes MCAS. So M365, I think they've renamed it to M365 Business, which was E3, and now it's M365 Business Premium, I believe. That's now E5. So the confusion continues, but to Chris's point, all of the automated features typically are within that higher security level. So it's a tough question. We'd be happy to help you kind of dissect that though. Is there another question?
The queue is empty right now.
Okay.
I think we've answered everything that's out there so far. And we are just about at time. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and close out the broadcast. Again, thanks everyone for attending. Thank you, Griffin and Chris, for your knowledge and expertise. Please check our virtual events page for more information on other events and their recording for today's event. And please attend the survey, links in the chat there. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great weekend.
All righty. Thanks again, everyone, for joining.